microworms, or Panagrellis redivivus. They're a staple in the hobby. They are up there with baby brine as a must-have when breeding fish and feeding fry. They also make a great food source for nano fish. Just remember when feeding, they can stay alive for up to 8 hours in the water, so you don't want to overfeed. Join me as I take you step by step on how to divide a mother culture into multiple cultures. We'll also discuss how to care for your microworm cultures and also how to feed them. When dividing cultures of microworms, you're going to need a few supplies. A mother culture of microworms, deli containers. I use the durable 8-ounce deli containers. Oh, and lids. You gotta have lids. I prefer instant mashed potatoes. You can also use oatmeal, but I think that instant mashed potatoes doesn't smell as bad. A spoon for scooping and mixing. Some filter floss for plugging up the air hole. Activated dry yeast for feeding the culture. And a knife for carefully poking the air holes in the tops of the lids. These are all the supplies you need. Now we're going to get to cooking. Oh wait! We also have boiling water. Instant mashed potatoes dissolve the best in boiling water. It's not boiled yet, but it will be when we mix it. So what we want to do now is we want to poke a hole carefully in the top of the lid with the steak knife. What I'm doing is I'm slowly holding my finger as a backer and turning the knife to poke a nice little round hole. You want to do this very gently because you can push right through the lids just because they are on the weaker side. But I'm going to go through, I'm going to poke the rest of the holes in here, and then we're going to add our filter floss to act as a breather hole and filtration to keep out any unwanted insects. Alright, enough of that music. What we need to do now is grab the filter floss. We're going to tear off a little tiny piece here and kind of fluff it up, make sure the layers are consistent, so I'm folding it over, and then I'm rolling it. What the doubling over and rolling does is it helps to make sure that there aren't any gaps or cracks or anything in the filter floss itself, so where any smaller flying insects could get in there, such as fruit flies or putrid flies. As I pushed through, I couldn't get it, so I gently used the knife tip to grab the filter floss and help push it through the hole to where I was able to grab it with my fingers. This may take some practice, but just be careful not to stab yourself. I won't bore you with putting filter floss in all the holes, but what we want to do now is just cut the tag ends. I cut them pretty flush on the bottom so the worms don't get stuck to them, and then I actually keep a little bit of a tag about the rim length of it, and I pulled it out. That's bound to happen. Let's redo. Well, I've got another lid here with some filter floss in it. What I'm going to do is cut all the way through before lifting the scissors out and trim it level with the lid, and at the bottom cut it flush towards the bottom. What I'm doing now is fluffing out the filter floss, which is on the top and bottom, making sure that the hole is 100% covered so that no foreign insects can get in. The water has finished boiling and it is time to measure out our mashed potatoes. What I try to do is set out all of the cups that I'm going to make, or at least plan to make ahead of time. That way it just makes measuring things out a lot easier. I don't use the most expensive mashed potatoes, and there's really no point in using anything super expensive when culturing. We're going to be measuring out a 1/4 cup per culture. Of course, I'm going to make a massive mess when it comes to measuring out dry goods. Why wouldn't I? I'll get it cleaned up afterwards, but as you can see, I'm not being super precise, but I'm getting pretty close to about a 1/4 cup and maybe a few extra flakes here and there or on the stovetop as well. But getting those measured out, laid down in, and you know, it's not an exact science. You don't have to be perfect with it, so don't stress on having to level out the measuring cups or anything like that. Just pour in. Really what this is it's a foundation for the microworms to breed on and multiply. So now it's time to add the water. I'm going to add increments of 1/8 cup at a time to each culture. The key to making these cultures is the media. You do not want to make a wet, soggy media. That will spoil the culture very, very fast. That's why it's key to slowly add water in small increments and mix as you go. What I'm doing now is I'm mixing up that 1/8 cup of boiling water that I added in, trying to spread that moisture around as much as physically possible. You can see that it's still clumping, so we're not there yet as to the consistency and moisture level that's needed, because it's a very fine balance about mixing media, of getting just the right moisture content to where it's not too wet and not too dry. Too dry, the culture will actually suffer because there's not enough moisture, and obviously too wet, there's too much moisture and it can open the things for rot and disease and things like that. So I've added another 1/8 cup of water here, mixing it around, and now that you can see, the texture is fantastic. It's that little pasty texture. It spreads around, but you're still really kind of got to push it a little bit and get firm with the mashed potatoes so that everything holds in place. One good test to make sure that the mashed potatoes are how they want is once you get them mixed up into the container and smashed around and leveled out to where you want them, turn the container upside down just like a Dairy Queen milkshake. If everything stays in there, perfect. If it starts to drip out, that means there's too much. If you can flip it upside down and actually see dry flakes on the bottom where the sidewall connects to the bottom, then that means you need to add just a little bit more water. What will happen if you don't add a little more water is as the culture ages, any moisture that's in that culture will be drawn towards those dry flakes, and it will actually help to dry out that culture much faster and make your cultures really struggle as they begin to boom. So make sure you check those moisture content in your media. After we've got the media mixed up to the consistency that we want, it's time to add a little bit of yeast. The yeast that I'm using is Fleischmann's or Fleischmann's. You can get it right off of the shelf at Walmart. Your key goal with adding the yeast to the cultures is not to add that much. If you add too much yeast, what happens is the culture doesn't get an opportunity to establish, and the yeast actually outgrows the culture and makes the culture sour. In this example here, I'm going to show you roughly a good amount of yeast that you want per worm ratio that you're going to add. As the camera focuses here, you can kind of see all the smaller dots. That's exactly what you want. It gives the opportunity for the yeast to take off but not get consumed too rapidly by the microworms, but also there's not enough yeast to where the yeast actually takes over the microworms and ends up souring the culture too quickly and killing off of the culture. Here's an even closer close-up of the sprinkling of the yeast. It's not very big. It's like an off grayish color, but I don't know how many sprinkles of yeast particles that is there, but that's the rough estimation of what you want when you sprinkle. It's time to put the yeast on the rest of these cultures, put the caps on, and let them cool off so we can add some worms.
One eternity later.
Now that the media is cool, we can start taking the lids off to inoculate the cultures with microworms. You can see with all of the lids here, they're labeled with what the cultures are and the date that they were prepared. This is always good for reference in case later on down the line you end up getting several different types of cultures together and you can safely throw out a few. What I'm doing here is I'm skimming off of the top of the culture where the thicker congregation of worms is going to be, and I'm just kind of spreading them out a little bit. You don't have to go super intense with spreading out the worms throughout the entire media, because over time, as the culture itself grows, the worms will spread out and start crawling up the sides and on the lids and things like that. But A good initial spread out just kind of helps inoculate a good majority of the media. That way you can kind of populate as much as possible. With these new cult starter cultures inoculated and the old culture harvested from, if the old culture's media is still good, it's not smelling or producing mold, you can save that culture because there's still going to be a lot of microworms in it. We won't be able to harvest off of these cultures for at least 2 weeks. A good indicator as to when you can start harvesting is when you look on the sides of the container and you can start seeing a lot of microworms crawling up the container and onto the lid. It's always best to have multiple cultures going at once. You will get crashes occasionally. The best way to store your microworms is in a dark, room temperature area away from any extreme heat or light. The most common pests that you'll get in microworm cultures are fruit flies, so make sure those lids stay on tight and the filter floss stays in the vent hole. To feed microworms to your fish, simply take your finger or a utensil and wipe it along the side of the container. Once you have a glob in your finger or on a utensil, stick it down in the water. I like to swirl the glob of microworms around in the water, that way it spreads it all the way throughout the tank. I hope you've enjoyed this video and possibly learned something. Drop a comment down below, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe. Gotta go, gotta grow.